Okay, so this video is going to be on plant evolution, some of the basic patterns that we've uncovered about plants and their characteristics. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we start off with plant evolution, we have to really go back about 450 million years ago to a group of green algae. So the pictures that you see, you have some green algae on the left and a primitive plant. It's actually moss right there on the right. But there's a group of green algae called charophytes. And charophytes appear to have a lot in common with the most primitive plants at the time, from what we can tell from DNA evidence and fossils, and even the more primitive plants that are still alive today. And for instance, we see that charophytes and very primitive plants, they're both multicellular. They both contain the same types of chlorophyll. There's different types of chlorophyll needed to do photosynthesis, and charophytes and early plants have those same types. Each the green algae charophytes and early primitive plants, they store their energy as starch. Through photosynthesis, they'll make sugar, and then that sugar is converted into starch as a stored source of energy. Both have cellulose in their cell walls, and this is a common feature between the green algae ancestors and primitive plants. And also, both reproduce with sperm and egg. So, in order to reproduce sexually, they produce sperm cells that will swim and fertilize egg and to make a zygote. And so, yes, charophytes, green algae, and early primitive plants have sperm that actually swim through water in order to reproduce. So when we look at the plant evolution, like I said, earlier a moment ago, mosses are some of the earliest, most primitive plants that are still alive on Earth today. And when you look at some very basic features of moss, they're very small growing. They don't grow very tall off the ground, and they're non-vascular. And we'll explain what that means in a moment. But these are some very basic features of moss, and tracing back to their ancestry about 450 million years ago. In this diagram here, we kind of see the phylogenetic history of plants from their green algae ancestor. Mosses being the most primitive that are kind of around today. And then you see the evolution of a vascular system, which leads to ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Well, ferns are a little different from angiosperms and gymnosperms because ferns are seedless. They don't make seeds, but gymnosperms and angiosperms do. So how do gymnosperms and angiosperms differ? Well, it's really how they produce their seeds. Gymnosperms produce their seeds in cones, and angiosperms are the names of plants that make flowers and fruits. So it's a nice little diagram that kind of traces the phylogenetic history of plants that we see on Earth today. So when we look at plants, plants live on land for the most part, and green algae were mostly aquatic. So in order to live life on land, there had to be some challenges that had to be overcome. For instance, living on land presents a big challenge. Moisture. In order to survive on land, you have to have a way to retain moisture. In the animation, we have a plant leaf here losing water through the process called transpiration. And if this plant loses too much water, it'll dehydrate and die. So there has to be a way for plants to maintain their water levels. And when we look at where we find evidence of early plant life, early plant life grew along, water's edge, rivers, lakes, streams, oceans, where moisture was more abundant. But when we look today, plants today have colonized most habitats on land. So in order to achieve that, they had to find a way to overcome water loss. And so a couple of the solutions I want to mention, one of them are called stomata, tiny microscopic pores, usually on the backside of leaves, and these pores can open and close to allow gas exchange. In the picture, Here's a zoomed in magnified view of a stomate. Stomate is singular, stomata is plural. And when open, the stomate will take in gases such as carbon dioxide and will release oxygen that it makes through photosynthesis. Now, when the stomate is closed, like it is in this picture right here, water is less likely to escape through evaporation. So by having these pores and the ability to open and close them, they're able to regulate some of their water loss. Another way to regulate water loss is by having their leaves covered in a layer of wax. And plant leaves are covered in a layer of a waxy coating called the cuticle. And here's a great picture here that shows a stomata or a stomate. And you can see the crisscrossing of the wax build up on this picture right here on this leaf. And it's a way to trap water on the inside so they are less likely to dry out. Wonderful adaptations to survive on land. Another land adaptation, another challenge to life on land I want to mention is the ability to transport nutrients and resource. You know, plants can be really, really tall and they have to have a way to transport nutrients and water from the ground where their roots are to the treetops, for instance. And so a solution that has evolved over time is a vascular system. A vascular system is kind of like the circulatory system that animals have. A vascular system is a way to transport nutrients throughout the entire plant, throughout the entire organism. And so if we zoom on into this tree trunk, let's go ahead and do that. So here's a tree trunk, and if we look, inside, we see these little tubes, and these are part of the vascular system. You may have heard of the xylem and the phloem in, maybe perhaps middle school classes. Well, through these tubes, through the blue ones called the xylem, water, for instance, will come up from the roots. The roots will absorb water, and water will travel up these xylem tubes and ultimately reach the treetops where the cells up there need water. So it's a great way for them to transport water distances. Well, the other tubes, the pink ones in this case labeled the phloem, there are tubes, and again, sugars, which are created through photosynthesis in the treetops, in the leaves at the top of the tree, sugars will be sent down these tubes to the lower parts of the plants, and therefore all the cells of the tree are able to get nutrition. And so here's a great picture kind of showing the tubes, kind of a cross section here, showing the tubes of the vascular system. And through these tubes, water and sugars and other nutrients can travel and be transported throughout the entire plant. And so a vascular system has really allowed plant life to grow to greater heights. In this picture here, here's a picture of moss. Moss is a primitive non-vascular plant. It doesn't have a vascular system. But you look at redwood trees, for instance. Redwood trees are vascular, and there's a reason why they are the tallest organisms on Earth. A couple 100 feet tall are redwood trees, and they have vascular tubes to transport nutrients. So while we're on the topic of height with the picture of the redwood tree, I want to mention another land challenge and the ability to grow upright. Underwater, your body weight is supported. If you ever play, games in a swimming pool with friends and you're picking friends up underwater, your friends are very easy to pick up underwater because water supports weight. But that same friend that was very easy to pick up underwater is very difficult to pick up outside of water. So water supports weight, and if trees like this can live on land, they have to have a way to support their own weight. Yes, plants have roots which grow throughout the ground and help support them. But an analogy I want to make here is the brick wall, and there's cement in between every brick to help hold the wall up, and that's called mortar. Well, the analogy I want to make to mortar is what's called lignin. Lignin is a molecule that helps the cell wall of plants harden. and it's what gives wood its strength. And when you look at this picture here, we have hundreds of cells right here tightly compacted together with each cell wall hardened and stiff, made up of lignin, which again look kind of like the mortar in between the bricks. So one way that trees can grow so tall, besides having a vascular system, is they have little cement in between their cells called lignin. So living on land, we already mentioned, has presented some problems for plants. Wind can topple an organism over or dry it out. Retaining moisture is a problem. Exposure to UV, support so you can grow tall. But we haven't really mentioned how plants reproduce on land. Organisms like animals that reproduce in the water, what often happens is the males will release sperm into the ocean water, for instance, and females will release eggs into the ocean water, and the sperm and eggs will just mix with one another and fertilization will occur. But on land, there's really no water to swim through. Now, some plants actually, like mosses, we mentioned mosses, some plants actually do reproduce on land with swimming sperm cells. Moss simply reproduce after it's rained and there's a layer of water on the ground, but many plants aren't like that. So reproducing on land without the use of water is a challenge, and many plants have overcome that challenge with a few neat little adaptations. One of their solutions is the evolution of pollen. Pollen is simply many times released into the air and travels with the wind, or pollen can be spread by animals. Here's a microscopic image of pollen. And in this picture here, you can see a gentleman is kind of shaking the branches of a tree, and dust is coming out of these cones that you see. And that dust is pollen. Many people have allergies to pollen. In this case, the pollen is just being spread through the air and through the wind. In some cases, like you see in this picture here, this bumblebee is covered in a yellow dust, and that yellow dust is pollen. This bumblebee will fly from flower to flower to flower, feeding on nectar, but at the same time spreading pollen. And so these are two ways in which pollen is transferred. I want to look at the bumblebee example in a little more detail. So here we have flower number one, and it's got four structures that produce pollen. The red dots are supposed to be pollen. And what happens is a bumblebee will come around and buzz around the flower and feed off of the nectar. And as it's buzzing around, it gets that red pollen all over its body and then flies away. Well, let's follow that bumblebee. So nearby flower number one is flower number two, and here comes the bumblebee. Last time we saw it a moment ago, it was covered in pollen, and the bumblebee's just doing the same thing. Walking around flower number two, and as it does, some of the pollen that was attached to its body falls onto flower number two, and this is pollination. So this is one way that plants have adapted to life on land, is through the use of pollinating animals such as bumblebees. Well, another adaptation to help them reproduce on land is the evolution of seeds. Here's an avocado seed in the picture. A seed has a hard protective coat, but inside the seed, there's an actual embryo. When we look at this little drawing here of an avocado seed, yeah, the outside has a hard protective coat, but inside there's a bunch of nutrition for the embryo to feed off of. Eventually the seed will crack open and the embryo will have little tiny leaves and it's able to do photosynthesis. But inside of a seed is an embryo, and it's a way, and wherever seeds eventually settle on the ground, hopefully the seed will continue to grow and sprout into a new plant. One of the defining features of plants is a life cycle that plants go through called alternation of generations, where plants alternate between the haploid and diploid stage in their life cycles. And this is a very generic diagram, but this is a diagram that's fairly true of all plants. If we look at the zygote, at this point in the school year, I hope you know what a zygote is. It's a fertilized egg created from the fusion and the union of a sperm and egg cell. So a zygote, follow the arrow, will divide by mitosis and grow into something called a sporophyte. So The sporophyte is simply the adult name for the diploid stage in the life of a plant. So an adult sporophyte, and depending on the plant, it could take decades for a sporophyte to reach adulthood. Some plants go through life in 1 year. Other plants can live for decades and decades. So in the name sporophyte, I hope you see the prefix for the word spore. So plants create something called spores, and if you follow the arrow to the left, spores are created through the process of meiosis. So therefore, spores are going to be haploid. And so haploid spores are created by meiosis. And so now we've entered the haploid stage in the alternation of generations that plants exhibit, where they spend they spend part of their life cycle as a diploid organism and part of their life as a haploid. So those haploid spores will land in the ground and the spores will grow. Some spores will grow into what's called a male gametophyte. Other spores will grow into what's called a female gametophyte. So some spores, when they land on the ground, will grow into the male gametophyte, as I just mentioned. And other spores, when they land on the ground, will grow into the female gametophyte. Now, in the word gametophyte, there's a prefix for the word gamete. And so the male gametophyte will create the male gamete, which is called sperm. The female gametophyte will create the female gamete, which is called an egg. And so I hope you see what we're setting up. We're setting up the bringing together of egg and sperm from the gametophytes. The male gametophyte releases sperm, the female gametophyte makes an egg. And now we're back to where we started. The sperm and the egg will fuse and fertilization will occur to create a diploid zygote. The zygote, again, is diploid, so the zygote marks the beginning of the diploid stage again. And that zygote will then grow into another sporophyte, and the whole cycle repeats itself. So when we look at the ecology of plants, remember ecology is studying how life interacts with the environment. Plants are often in a mutualistic relationship with another organism. Now the picture doesn't show plants, it's just a classic example of mutualism involving a clownfish that lives amongst the tentacles of an anemone. So the clownfish benefits by getting a home and protection. The clownfish can also feed off of the leftover food scraps of the anemone. The anemone benefits because the anemone is also protected from smaller invertebrates by the clownfish, and it will also feed off of the feces of the clownfish. So it's a great example of mutualism where both benefit. Well, but what about plants? Let's look at a great example of mutualism involving bacteria and plants. So in this picture here, we're zoomed in, and in this picture here, it shows the roots of legumes, like beans. And notice how there's little bumps or nodules. These are little growths of bacteria. These nodules, and they grow amongst the roots of plants. So we have two organisms living together here. We have plants and we have bacteria. Well, let's explain how this is mutualistic. So the reason this is a mutualistic relationship is the bacteria supply ammonia that the plant desperately needs. The plant's roots will take in the ammonia and grow. Well, what about the bacteria? The bacteria benefits because it will the plant supplies nutrients, particularly produced through photosynthesis, that the bacteria needs to survive. So it's a great example of a mutualistic relationship with plants. With plants and bacteria. So kind of a more classic example of mutualism involving plants is a relationship between plants and pollinating animals. In this case, the plant supplies food or nectar for whoever the pollinator is, whether it's a bumblebee, whether it's a hummingbird, and in the picture here you see it's a butterfly. So the plant supplies food. What about the pollinator? The pollinator spreads pollen for the plant. As the pollinator flies from flower to flower to flower, it spreads pollen and achieves pollination in order for the plant to reproduce. Again, a classic example of mutualism. Well, let's not forget that plants have to defend themselves against herbivore predators, and plants have all kinds of adaptations to defend themselves against herbivores. Spines, thorns, chemicals to fight off herbivores. You know, in the picture here, here's a cactus, and you can see all the thorns that surround the cactus. And if you're a hungry herbivore, you're probably going to have a hard time eating this plant, and so you'll choose to eat another plant that is less protected. So again, a wonderful adaptation in order to defend themselves against herbivores. You know, I grew up in Illinois, and I had to be very wary of poison ivy. If you're ever playing baseball or throwing a frisbee around and the ball or the frisbee lands in a patch of poison ivy, you have to know what it looks like. And the saying, if you haven't heard it before, is called leaves of three, let it be. Here we see the telltale signal of poison ivy, these three leaves grouped together. And if you ever do reach in to get the baseball or get the frisbee, well, you might come down with a real nasty rash a couple of days later, so really itchy. It's not life-threatening, but my point is that poison ivy is poisonous. Again, not poisonous to the point where a person's going to die, but herbivores become wary of eating plants that get them sick or that could give them a really nasty rash. And so it's a great defense mechanism against herbivores. So there you go. There's the end of this video. You know, if you're in my biology class, pause the video, try to answer these questions, and I'd be happy to check your answers before school or after school one day. So go ahead and pause the video, and good luck.